Council for Indigenous Business, Mr. Matthew Foss, Vice President, Research and Public Policy. From the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, Mr. Andrew Leach, Chair, Board of Directors, Tali Atu Aboriginal Capital Corporation. And from the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, Grand Chief Joel Abram, who is connecting virtually. So with that, I will turn it over first to Mr. Foss for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Tanashi, Matthew Foss, Dishnikashun. Hello, my name is Matthew Foss. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. As Vice President of Research and Public Policy for the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, I want to thank you and Mr. Chair and those involved with this opportunity to provide some comments for the study on tax revenues from businesses on First Nations territories. Since 2013, the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business has been conducting research on Indigenous economic development corporations and broader Indigenous community economic development initiatives. Our 2019 study found that many, about a third, reinvest 21 to 50% of their after-tax revenues back into the community. Some, about 15%, reinvested between 75 and 100% of those revenues into the community, and few, about 20%, reinvested only 0 to 5%. This funding helps to support infrastructure development, social and business programs, and really anything that the community decides to spend it on. The main challenges in engaging the community include getting community members' attention and then, once they are aware, helping them understand the role and approach of the Indigenous Economic Development Corporation. Participants cited numerous community benefits from economic development corporations. Over half indicated that the most significant benefits are that they support digital infrastructure and provide employment income. About a quarter pointed to the support for physical infrastructure, keeping members in the community, and helping to strengthen the community economy. About 20% highlighted that economic development corporations contribute to a stronger sense of community pride and fund local services and programs. Communities should be directly receiving a share of the value of the economic activity that happens in their territory. Taxation from businesses operating on reserve provides an opportunity to generate own source revenues to support community priorities and projects, particularly in the case of non-Indigenous businesses where the income is brought in from elsewhere. In the current state of affairs, much of these taxes are already generated, they just go to a different source. So it only makes sense to redirect them to the First Nations governments. At least in this way, they will be able to better support community priorities, including addressing the $349 billion infrastructure gap facing their communities, and work to address other issues like digital connectivity and reinvestment into the many social initiatives that exist. Turning the revenues over directly to First Nation governments helps to strike the right balance between taxation and facilitating Indigenous entrepreneurship. Indigenous entrepreneurs provide employment and income for themselves and other community members. This enables diversification of the local economy, skills development and employment opportunities, and most importantly, positive role models for people to aspire to. There's a need to ensure that these efforts keep them in mind. First Nations entrepreneurs are already reinvesting their revenues back into their communities and other priorities through social finance and charitable initiatives. Some companies, like Birchbark Coffee Company, reinvest a portion of their revenues from every bag of coffee sold to support Indigenous clean water initiatives, do this consistently, while others, such as artists like Patrick Hunter, will engage in initiatives like developing designs for orange t-shirts and donate those revenues to support Indigenous children's initiatives. Many First Nations entrepreneurs and people hold reservations around taxation. While First Nations people share out of abundance, taxation differs from that. While taxation did exist within some pre-contact Indigenous societies, these were relatively few and far between. For the vast majority of First Nations, sharing was done more informally and aligned with the cycles of abundance and scarcity. It was done when needed to ensure that there was enough to go around for everyone, and was not always a given. Given this and the fact that Indigenous entrepreneurs already face a number of barriers relating to taxation, access to finance in general, it's important to ensure not to create a situation where communities require double taxation and load burdens on businesses. Simply providing First Nations with the ability to raise revenues from activities on their territories risks overtaxing Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs. Already, Indigenous entrepreneurs have highlighted in our interviews that a predatory nature can exist within some First Nations communities where entrepreneurs do not feel supported within their communities. Having the money that they already pay in taxation go directly to their communities would alleviate some of these pressures. It's also important to note that the transfer of tax jurisdiction does not absolve the federal government of its fiduciary obligations to First Nations peoples and communities. Many communities cite concerns that their federal funding will be cut after they start generating their own source revenues. We need to clarify that own source revenues will not impact federal transfers, as is the case for provinces. I think it's important for the Government of Canada to clarify this misunderstanding of their obligations to First Nations people and would call on them to do so. As things stand, this fear can pose a major impediment to engaging with resource development and broader economic development.
Mr. Foss, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up, please.
Yes. There's a need to continue discussions around the money that's being held in trust for First Nations community by the federal government and how that's currently being allocated. With all that being said, thank you for the opportunity to lend Canadian Council for Indigenous Business voice and that of our members to this important topic, and I look forward to questions that you may have. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foss. Next up, I will hand over the floor to Mr. Leach for a 5-minute introductory speech.
Thank you. This is on, right? Good. Well, hello, everyone. Good to see you all today. It's a real honor to be here. I'm with the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association. We've got a head office not too far from here. I'll summarize my notes that I submitted in, so I'll get done in 5 minutes. I've seen how many pages Matthew had, and I think I don't want to be cut off, so I'll just quickly summarize what I've got, okay? First of all, NACA has been around for 30-some-odd years. We basically lend money, development dollars, to Indigenous entrepreneurs across Canada from coast to coast to coast. In the early 90s, the federal government put out $200 million or so to these capital corporations across Canada. We lent that money out, got paid back, lent that money out, got paid back, and we've grown that $200 million into $3.4 million of loans, $3.4 billion of loans over the last 30 years. And what I think we can bring value to this table is that in lending money to Indigenous entrepreneurs from coast to coast to coast, we get information from them. When they fill out an application, just think about the information that you would have to put on a loan application. We have boots on the ground across the country, and when people don't pay their loans, we know. So when COVID hit, it was very, very important for the government to know what's going on out there, and what better source to go after who's paying their loans on that given month, and who would collectively have that information across the country for Indigenous communities in the business sector, but NACA, because that's our nature of our business. So I think that's the value that we can bring here today, which is knowing what's on the information that we've been able to collect with the individual financial institutes across the country, and collectively what NACA has been able to provide, what's going on out there and the most latest, what sectors are being growing, what types of businesses, how many employees are being created, what types of revenues are being generated, who's paying their loans, stuff like that. And I think what we've been able to see over the last 20 years is that the Indigenous communities that are most active, and dare I say aggressive, in applying the new laws and policies that have been coming down, including the Fiscal Management Act and the land codes that have been created through the Land Management Act, have done tremendous benefit. Because we know the constraints of the Indian Act. We hear this for too long now. But we know that these laws have been applied, and those who've been applying them the best have been able to really grow in their communities. Our correlation between the amount of activity that's going on in an area, in a community, and their ability to apply those new laws and policies are very clear. And so we think that this idea of moving forward to the taxation question and how that might roll out and what could be done is a very valuable, a very important question. Because we do believe that those laws and those policies that have created a better environment, I mean, we're trying to live within the Indian Act, basically, that by creating these things will only, for those who are going to apply it, do well. And this idea that now that we can extend it to a tax regime for businesses that are doing work in First Nations backyard is a good thing. And the three that you brought up in your motion, which included the, just want to be sure of my time, by the way, which included the excise taxes, the ATM casino sales, and the carbon taxes. The thing I just wanted to say about excise taxes, our loans that we give, a lot of those clients are providing services to First Nations, and they would be tax exempt. So the idea of getting tax revenues from excise taxes from on-reserve, tobacco sales, cigarettes, et cetera, I'm not so sure. But if there's something that could be done, great. With respect to casino and ATM, obviously a lot of the non-Indigenous who are frequent to these places, there's probably a better tax base from that. And then finally on the carbon taxes, nice issue for you guys to deal with in Ottawa. We can see that a lot of those industries are right in the backyard of First Nations communities. If there was some regime that could be created that could provide benefit back to these communities so that they could create the infrastructure that's needed, just seems to make sense, especially since many of those industries are affecting the traditional way of life, the food sources of those people. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leach, and right on time for 5 minutes, so thank you for that. Next up, I'd like to turn over the floor to Grand Chief Abram for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you very much, and hopefully you can hear me in the room. I know there was a few issues, but thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words in front of the committee today. I appreciate that. My name is Grand Chief Joel Abram. As I said, the Grand Chief of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians in Ontario, and I currently hold the portfolio for economic development within the Chiefs of Ontario for the province of Ontario. And as of that, I chair the Chiefs Committee on Economic Development. And for sure, we've been focusing on a few different items there around excise tax, casino ATM, and also carbon taxes. But if I can say a few words before that around economic reconciliation and about land holding and tax base. I think one of the areas that I want to really talk about is, how does Canada hold fiduciary obligations for First Nations? And it is through Canada's, how they came to claim most of the land. Our First Nation understanding of treaties is that they were of sharing rather than of surrender. However, interpreters of those told First Nations people one thing and government another. And so that, and we know that doctrines of supremacy are also influenced in how Canada claims not only the legislative power over First Nations, but also claims over land and those sorts of things. So we know that those doctrines of superiority are based in racism from the 1400s coming from papal bulls. And so we think it's long past due that we start to unwind these things and decolonize and start to recognize First Nations sovereignty and jurisdiction. So our Chiefs of Ontario Committee, we're focused on some things like excise tax sharing and its possible feasibility. For instance, we have Grand River Enterprises, which pays hundreds of millions of dollars in excise taxes to the federal government. But Six Nations, where that community, where that comes from, that doesn't really get those excise taxes back in forms from the federal government. So we have talked about focusing on excise tax, and our work has been ongoing. We did a legal feasibility study recommending that we move forward with a back tax sharing framework mentioned in the federal budget. And also, we're exploring excise tax revenue sharing options that could retain profits within communities, which can then be utilized for community needs, whilst the tax collection powers and responsibilities would remain with the Canadian Revenue Agency. We're also looking forward to participating and providing input to future federal tax sharing and framework creation. And we also hope the federal government's consultation framework for the creation of the tax sharing framework will include provincial government representatives as well to address back taxes remitted to the province. So regardless of whether Section 89 applies to excise tax, it's up to the federal provincial government to create new revenue sharing agreements with First Nations leaders and communities to ensure tax profits are allotted to First Nations community needs. Around casino ATM taxes, I think we know from Bill C-92 and the recent Supreme Court decision around that when Quebec challenged the legitimacy of that. We do know now that the federal government has the power to legislate even in areas where provinces have the mandate to have, for instance, health. And C-92 was about child welfare, but the federal government did give jurisdiction over child welfare to First Nations, and they could do the same thing with regards to gaming. And so that's something that I think we should take a serious look at. But with the topic of casino taxes and ATM taxes, the problematic provincial cartel system, as you like to call it, it hurts First Nation gaming hosts from maximizing their profit. And so we can also, federal government can also provide partnership.
Monsieur le Président, je me dois de vous arrêter. En français ne se fait plus s'il y a...
Sorry to interrupt, but the interpretation is not possible, and there have been some comments about the quality of the sound not being adequate, and I'd like to thank the interpreter for having done so much for having done her best to interpret that. Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Dan, we're having some trouble with the sound on your microphone. It's not coming through very clearly.
Okay.
Perhaps what we could do is we can have the technicians call you and to see if they can find a way to clarify your sound, and then perhaps just bring you in after that's been done, because unfortunately we can't continue unless your sound is coming in clearly, and so at the very least perhaps we can bring you back in for the second round of questioning, as well as to finish your opening statement for another 40 seconds or so.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess with that, we'll move into the first round of questioning, starting with Mr. Zimmer for the Conservative Party with 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses, especially Grand Chief Abrams and Matthew Foss and Andrew Leach. I think we have some Edmonton Oilers fans with us today. I think so, by the smiles. I'm another one, so let's hope. Here we are. But anyway, the one thing that I really appreciated from Grand Chief Abram is the discussion about economic reconciliation. We've heard previous committee meetings here talking about reconciliation, how important economic reconciliation is to reconciliation. So just a question to you all, how important is economic reconciliation to reconciliation? We'll start with Mr. Foss and we'll go around.
Well, I think it's fundamental. Until Indigenous communities are able to participate effectively in Canada's economy and have the means to self-direct revenues to their own priorities, and have businesses that are successful, have opportunities for their children, being the fastest growing population in the country, and we won't see social challenges that exist within those communities rectify. And so.
Mr. Leach.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're talking to a business guy, so obviously there's a slant there. I think economic reconciliation is the key to reconciliation, that we can do best for ourselves than anybody can do for us. And the biggest issue that we have is to close that gap, that economic gap. And by focusing on that in terms of reconciliation, I think we all can get on board with whatever background you may have, that we need to deal with that. And by us having the best control over that, I think you'll get the best outcomes. So I believe it is the central piece, and that it is the path for us to move on all of reconciliation.
And I don't see Grand Chief is quite available yet, so I'll move on. We have seen and heard from countless Indigenous communities that although there are resource developments occurring within their boundaries, they often find it difficult to access capital. And I know, Mr. Foss, you've spoken about in both, actually, that providing that capital has made such a difference in those communities. But they need capital to accelerate First Nations economic growth. They need capital to increase First Nations jobs, promote First Nation residential development, and also to help mitigate the infrastructure gap on First Nations, or facing First Nations. What ways could, and I think we need to, I would specifically say, we're talking about existing tax revenues. We're not talking about an addition, because I think you said, Mr. Leach, that adding taxes isn't necessarily great for business, right, and great for the communities. What ways could existing tax revenues from businesses on First Nation territories be placed under the control of those First Nations themselves, or better directed so as to increase resources available to First Nations? And we'll start, let's start with Mr. Leach this time. We'll go to Mr. Foss.
Okay, thank you. As I had mentioned on the three that were cited in your motion, the excise, the casino, and the carbon, that those resources, if they were reshifted over towards First Nations, I know this firsthand, that when we get control, we will be responsible. We will be very judicious in it, and we'll start thinking. And we see it with all those that are doing well. It's not like they're having a big party. They're actually putting the money back into their communities. And where we're really facing that shortage is on infrastructure. And I do believe that if there was a plan put in place to target it, something like infrastructure, you would see the money is going towards that. Because the infrastructure is what provides the vehicle for more activity. And so if you can get rid of the legislative issues, which we've been doing to date, and now start dealing with the infrastructure issues, we're going to have a machine going. My concern, honestly, is if we lag on the infrastructure, we're going to slow down the train. And so to me, having a way to target it to the infrastructure is just going to be smart for First Nations, smart for Canada. Thank you.
Mr. Foss.
So much to say on this type of topic. I think first and foremost, communities themselves need to have control over revenues. That to do anything else is just another form of colonialism and paternalism that has dogged the communities since settlers came over, and I mean, capital, the access to capital is a fundamental challenge. More than 50% of Indigenous businesses cite that as one of their biggest challenges to operating, and the lack of infrastructure, the challenges around housing, clean water, and that exists in these communities. And as Mr. Leach said, the importance of letting the communities dictate where those revenues go. That we can't, as an outsider to any of these communities, dictate and tell them what the best thing that they can use to spend their money on. They have to determine based on their priorities what is most important for them at this time.
Right. Thank you. It's time. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zimmer. Next up for in the 6-minute round, Mr. Batiste, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. You know, one of the things that we're looking at is large infrastructure gaps in First Nations communities across Canada. One of the unfortunate things, because of the Indian Act and the history, is that many communities do not generate any taxation revenues in order to, pay for things like roads, pay for infrastructure, pay for all the things that First Nations communities need, unlike municipalities that have the ability to tax people for land, for homes, for all of these things. That's not something generally that they want, chiefs want in First Nations community. But Budget 2024 committed to moving forward in an opt-in fuel, alcohol, cannabis, tobacco tax framework. Do you think there's an appetite for this from First Nations communities across Canada? And if so, how do you see that working?
And myself first?
Either one of you.
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you. Thank you for the question. What I've loved about some of the laws that have been passed down to date is the opt-in option that I've heard in many communities. They're saying, we don't like that, we don't want that here. And I say, great, it's an opt-in option. You don't have to have it. But those who have opted in and have applied it seem to have done quite well with them. They seem to be quite satisfied with it. So I do wonder about the opt-in option where basically we're saying there's constraints with the existing environment. You don't have to get involved in this, but if you do, you can do it by this way. And we're going to basically transfer the rules that are over here to over here if you want. And if we take the leaders who will jump in there right away and start with it and learn from it, then we can continue to tweak. I think that's what we've done so far, and I think if we continue down that path, I think we'll not only learn from it, but we'll do better of it from an opt-in option. That's
Mr. Leach, before I go on to Mr. Foss, can you give me some examples of First Nations communities that have utilized kind of tax sharing and of this sort? You said that there were some that are doing well once they do this. Can you give me some examples of how that's worked?
Yeah, so what I'm actually specifically talking about is, for example, the Land Management Act. Okay, I'm more talking about the opt-in option from the Land Management Act. Okay, so we started out in 1999 or whatever. These 15 went forward, and then after that said, you guys don't have to change, but if you want, you can opt in. And I was just using that as the model, that those who have gone in and done it and have passed the motions in their community to go forward on it have been reasonably happy and have benefited economically from the change. But I do go to some communities where they say, we'll never go down that path. I say, you don't have to. You don't have to. It's an opt-in. It's an opt-in option. And I'm just using that as the example.
Okay, Mr. Foss, do you want to chime in?
Not a lot to say on that matter. I'll leave most of those remarks or that to rights holders to speak to directly. I would offer to you the importance of ensuring that those opt-in provisions don't create complexity for Indigenous businesses, that Indigenous businesses aren't subject to multiple layers of additional taxes and administration that might go along with that.
Do you see the Indigenous Loans Guarantee Program that we've kind of announced, I think it was $5 billion in the last budget, towards possibly helping Indigenous communities, basically being co-signers for Indigenous projects? Do you see that as part of the solution towards closing the infrastructure gaps in many communities?
Absolutely. It's a great step into that space to ensure that that capital is available and getting another tool through the loan guarantee towards that access to capital to help. And hopefully there will be more than just the $5 billion into the future.
Do you think NACA shows a best practice on how you can start with a small amount of loan programs and then have that build? Do you think this is possible from the Indigenous Loans Guarantee Program that currently out there?
Okay, we take it. I'm the NACA guy. Yes, and I agree with what Mr. Foss said. Any tool that we have that we can put on the table that somebody can try and put to use, let's do it. And with respect to the Indigenous Loan Guarantee, we've been able to leverage as much capital that comes our way and find partners and work with our communities to make that dollar go farther. And if there's money on the table that says this, we wouldn't have done it, but now that this is on the table, let's do it, that'd be great. The one tool that I have seen First Nations use has been the First Nations Finance Authority to put infrastructure dollars on the table that they probably otherwise wouldn't have. But if there's another avenue or something that they could add to that to continue building that infrastructure, great, all for it. I have loved seeing the projects that have borrowed off of the Finance Authority, have put a gas station, a road, other services in, and seen the economic activity that have come from that. And now they're ready to go after something else. And if this was another stream that they could do that with, great.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baptiste. With that, we're moving on to our notre troisième membre du premier.
On to Mr. Lemire. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Miigwech. First and foremost, I'd like to highlight a historic event that happened on the Hill just before this meeting. The Anishinaabe community was ceded the Wellington, the former Wellington building, which was the United States Embassy, which is a very concrete step towards reconciliation. So I want to highlight that because I've met with community leaders and they were very happy to be there. And I would like to highlight the work of chiefs for making this happen. But it was a very touching moment for the Anishinaabe community from my riding. My question is for NACA. And of course, we know this acronym in English, the National Aboriginal Council. So, Mr. Leach, should there be an organization federally to designate these organizations? You have done so much for various entrepreneurs with your targeted programs for women and for youth. Your Gatineau event is also a fantastic way to highlight the work that's done. Of course, you also have a lot of leadership. And of course, I would like to congratulate Jean-Vincent, Dean Malaby-Leach, and Manuela Perron for their great work. I think that we can reach 5% of federal procurement and more. Obviously, you are very well placed to guide us in our orientation with regards to procurement and access to goods and services, which would fall under the economic reconciliation category. Can you tell us more about organizing procurement for First Nations, first in its type, which would allow us to have contracts via certification for education and promotion?
Merci, thank you. Okay, yeah, NACA is in a unique place, I believe, because of what I'd mentioned, our access to entrepreneurs across Canada from coast to coast to coast. And the idea of the procurement came up, and it's developed over time to now we've developed some pretty solid position on this, and we've networked with our IFIs across the country, and this 5% target of government contracts going to Indigenous suppliers makes sense. I do wonder about the challenges of making that happen, and some of the things that we have to do on our side, some of the things you'd have to do on your side, and how we could better get to that place that we want to be. And certainly identifying who are Indigenous entrepreneurs and what that means and how we'd go about doing that and how we'd come up with some certification or questions we've all asked. Interesting, when we started this process, we even had to go inside ourselves as what qualified as an Indigenous business and had our own internal back and forth about what that possibly could mean. So it's been a learning process. Ultimately, at the end of the day, our entrepreneurs just want to do business, and if given the opportunity, they'd do it well. I believe that. And so how do we go about creating that? What I've always found is that we've got this side A and side B, and there's this in the middle that we've got to create that space there so that they link up better. And if we can do that, and however that might be, I think that's where we'll flourish. I can't help but think also about the procurements that are available First Nations vis-a-vis industry directly. That's where we seem to have had the most progress. And I've been to those offices right in First Nations communities where their procurement office is interfacing with industry directly and lots of activities coming from it. I think we could learn from them about how they do it and how we can imitate some of those things. And quite frankly, a lot of it's about relationship. We're very good on relationship. We know once we start that, we'll do it. And industry knocks on the door and says, I need this piece of equipment. I need this skilled labor right away. Do you have it? Yeah, we've got it. What do you need? So I think we need to look at that and start seeing how we might be able to imitate that for government procurement. Thank you.
Merci pour cette réponse effectivement concrète et à travers.
Thank you for that very clear answer. You pointed out that it is very important to recognize Indigenous or First Nations organizations. In Quebec, there is ID1N.org, which allows First Nations communities or organizations to certify themselves. And this allows them to operate outside of the federal government's jurisdiction. And we do know that under the federal jurisdiction, a lot can happen. For example, the ArriveCan scandal. But when the federal government gives out contracts, it's not. We know that they might not actually be Indigenous organizations. How do we make sure that we are certifying properly Indigenous organizations?
Merci. I think, quite honestly, bluntly, respectfully, we know best who's Indigenous and who's not. We do. And so if you give us the framework to create that, we will. Like I said, we've already started that process, and we've already started creating some goalposts. And if we were given the mandate to solidify those goalposts so that we know that when they're going over, that this will be there, that we will create those. And I believe that once we've been given that mandate, we will create them. Thank you.
Miigwech.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire. I have the unfortunate news to share that we weren't able to get Grand Chief's sound figured out. So I think as long as it's the will of the committee, we'll be able to invite him back and provide the testimony that he was able just to begin today. But we are very fortunate. We have two fantastic witnesses here today to direct your questions to. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I thank you, panel, for coming here. What you have to say is very important, and it is good to hear. My first question is pertaining to the economic reconciliation by Indigenous Services Canada, because it states here that they intend to work with Indigenous partners. Now, please explain your participation, if any, in the development of the economic reconciliation framework. To bring forward an economic reconciliation framework which will remove barriers and support Indigenous visions for economic prosperity. Can you explain your participation, if any, in the development of the economic reconciliation framework? I didn't get the order of the men she wanted, but go ahead.
Thank you for the question. We and a number of other Indigenous organizations have been gathering and discussing economic reconciliation, and we're part of a group along with NACA that created the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, and that with its 115 calls to economic reconciliation, and so we've been very active and involved with respect to what that pathway looks like as well. We gathered last month in Winnipeg with a number of other First Nations organizations, national First Nations organizations, to talk about what economic reconciliation means and needs, and we will be providing a report on that to government here, hopefully this summer, early fall, with our findings of that.
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking about all the different experiences I've had where this issue has come up and how we've muddled through it, if you will, because it's a new topic, it's a new idea in the last decade or so. But certainly at the NACA level, I was the former chair of NACA, by the way, and when I sat at that table, we were interfacing with government on various projects and various issues and started coming up, well, what does this mean? So we had our own internal thing that we'd have to communicate back and forth. And I've actually, in another life that I'm doing right now, is teaching courses on economic development with First Nations institutes. And one of the questions that are coming up at that level is, what is economic reconciliation? One of the questions I ask my students is, what is it to you? Here's some of the stuff that's coming up. And what I've learned is it means different things to different people. And we need to honor that it means different things to different people. But also in another life I've worked directly with First Nations in interfacing with industry on getting reasonably sizable projects off the ground with First Nations partnership. And we have to educate each other about what is going on and how it's impacting the First Nation from their perspective. And it takes time. That I've sat with industry and they're saying, why would we want to sign an agreement with, it says that we will not abrogate Indigenous rights? And we're going, well, that's kind of standard, but they don't know that. And so we have to educate each other about what we want. What I've noticed that, generally speaking, for us, we don't have time constraints. Generations isn't a big issue for us on a project. We're thinking long term. We're not here to buy this and turn it over and flip it in 10 years. We're thinking long term. I mean, 99-year leases don't mean much to us because we know we're going to be here in 99 years. And their mindset, I think we just have to start getting into that, is they operate at the speed of business. Time is much different. And so how we can understand each other and get business done, I think, is a learning process, but it's a good thing. And the more we learn from each other, the more we adapt with each other, and the more benefit, I think, can come from both of us. Thank you.
Okay.
You have about 45 seconds left.
Okay, I'll switch to. Are we having a second round?
Yes, there'll be a second round.
All right.
Okay.
I'll
Thank you.
finish for now. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. With that, we will move to the second round. Going up first, we have Ms. Rood for 5 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. Mr. Leach, you've talked a lot about economic reconciliation, and I have the pleasure of representing 5 different First Nations in my Southern Ontario riding, and that is a topic of discussion that's come up quite often in my meetings with the chiefs, especially of late. But they've told me that they want to be prosperous, they're seeking investments in their communities, but they find that they're being stonewalled right now by the current NDP Liberal government at every turn. And one of their largest concerns is the